it's not so much the attraction that's the problem, but perhaps what you do about it. And so I think what a lot of people who are consensually non-monogamous understand is that you can talk about these things and actually alleviate a lot of anxieties and a lot of fears around those experiences by learning to communicate about them with your partner.
What can consensual non-monogamous relationships teach us about communication, jealousy, and the way humans really bond? Today in the lab, we're joined by Dr. Justin Mogilski, an evolutionary psychologist and associate professor leading an international research team studying how people in consensually non-monogamous relationships make their relationships work. In this conversation, we explore attraction disclosure, jealousy, infidelity, parenting, and the surprising ways evolutionary psychology can help us better understand modern relationships. If you've ever wondered what science can teach us about love, attachment, and human connection, this episode is for you. Welcome to Sexology Lab. Each week, we speak with the most compelling minds in modern sexology to ask the questions shaping the future of desire, connection, and human wellness. Let's dive in. Welcome, Justin.
Hey, thank you for having me. It's fun to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for being with us today. I want to jump in with a question. Now, what is one thing that people in consensually non-monogamous relationships know about relationships that most monogamous couples don't?
Maybe the extent to which you can actually share information and you think that that information will be tricky to handle, but it's actually less tricky than you think. Where my mind goes to is one of the things that we identified in our research is something like attraction disclosure. So that is actually talking to your partner about your attractions to other people. And I think that that's often seen as kind of a big no-no, especially to monogamous people, because it's seen as kind of like this kindness to hide the information from your partner, not let them kind of deal with that or understand that you are human and that you may have attractions to other people. And it's not so much the attraction that's the problem, but perhaps what you do about it. And so I think what a lot of people who are consensually non-monogamous understand is that you can talk about these things and actually alleviate a lot of anxieties and a lot of fears around those experiences by learning to communicate about them with your partner. That's one of the biggest insights that I think people who are non-monogamous have, is that there's this set of challenges that comes along with having multiple partners. People who are monogamous deal with those same challenges, they just approach it a different way. And people who are CNM, consensually non-monogamous, approach it in a way that's a kind of bringing their partner into a lot of these decisions and kind of letting them go through maybe some of those difficult experiences and learning from them.
Yeah, I love that you said that, because I think growing up in a culture of monogamy, you're given this message that's like, you can't even look at another person or else it's like cheating,
Mhm.
and I think we're taught that you would never bring that up to a partner.
Yeah. It's de facto always cheating. And therefore, if you admit it, what you're doing is you're admitting you're lying. But really, what you could be doing is just admitting that you have an experience such as being attracted to someone else, wanting to explore that connection. And then maybe the decision is ultimately you don't, right? You talk about it with your partner and you decide that's actually something that's going to get in the way and it just isn't feasible. But at the same time, you could talk about it and maybe realize maybe there's a mutual benefit to potentially being non-monogamous or having, acting on those experiences. And if there is, what can we do to prevent some of the problems you might anticipate?
Now, I want to talk about you for a moment. So, what is your 30-second origin story? How did you find your way into sexual health research? And when did you realize this is my specialty area?
I didn't start here. I don't even know if I would call it my specialty area. I'm trained as an evolutionary psychologist. So I got my PhD at Oakland University. And there I studied things like infidelity, mate preferences, what people are looking for in a partner, what happens when people are mismatched on certain characteristics. And from that, kind of studying the adapted design of the brain and how our brain is helping us to navigate relationships and some of the problems that we'll encounter when we're in relationships. But then I met someone who was consensually non-monogamous. They were telling me, this is one of my experiences. And I said, oh, how do you make this work? And so honestly, it's just been a journey of, given what I had learned about relationships up to that point, how do you make it work? What are you doing? And is it actually successful? Because I think a lot of people kind of look at consensual non-monogamy and they think, well, this clearly isn't going to work. This isn't going to be successful. And yet there was someone here saying, hey, we make it work. We're happy. We're not hurting people. So I wanted to explore that.
Yeah, I love that. Now, what is one current shift or trend in the sexual health space that genuinely excites you right now?
I think how we communicate about, for example, STIs or things that are kind of difficult to talk about. So, for example, you can talk about disclose your attraction to someone else, to a partner, but when it comes to something like STIs, it's actually very difficult to trust the information that you get from someone else because very often those are private medical records. You can't actually go in and see, say, someone's status is. And so, what do you do to kind of foster trust or foster some sense that the information you are conveying is trustworthy? And I think that is going to be kind of a big wave of the future there. Otherwise, in terms of sexual health, a lot of sex tech is really starting to develop, especially for people who have had difficulties either having sex or getting into sex or whatnot because of certain physical limitations, mental limitations. And so some of the technology that helps with that, especially people who are older and who maybe, need assistance at no fault of their own, to the extent to which we're able to make these tools accessible in a way that helps people have more satisfying sex lives and relationships in general, the more that we make that available to people, the safer, more predictable, more reliable relationships get because of these tools. I think that will solve so many hardships in people's lives.
All right, now, if you could teach the world one essential insight about consensual non monogamy, something that really moves the needle, what would that be?
I think a lot of people believe that if you want to be non-monogamous, what you need is to be exceptionally intelligent or have a lot of self-control. I see this argument made to the extent that, well, okay, if you have more than one partner, you're going to have to inhibit some impulses to make sure that you are treating each partner well before you act on impulses or do the things that you want to. So there's a lot of kind of impulse control that helps. If you're intelligent, that helps to navigate a lot of the issues that you can run into with non-monogamy. I actually think that that is not necessarily the most productive way to look at it. The point is that ultimately, if you're smarter and you're kind of have impulse control, that can help with a lot. Most people have grown up in what we might call a mononormative culture. That is predominantly what you see is monogamy. Predominantly what you see are the practices for making monogamy work. Chances are people who are more intelligent or have better impulse control are probably doing better simply because people are not prepared to make non-monogamy work in a way that is more ethical or that doesn't harm people. If we were to prepare people better and give them good scripts for how to do non-monogamy, there would be less of a barrier to entry than most people believe. So if I had to kind of dispel a myth or comment on that, I think a lot of people are afraid of it because they think, I'm just not going to be able to make this work. It's important to realize that you're working from a place of kind of a disadvantage, right? You're working with not enough knowledge to really navigate some of the challenges that people experience. In general, we have very poor education about how to do that. And that is really what's getting in the way of navigating these kinds of relationships more responsibly.
Yeah. So you don't have to be a super genius to be in a CNM relationship. You just
I
have to
don't
have
think
some
so.
education and some frameworks to
Yeah.
follow.
Yep. And the experience and perhaps kind of a culture that supports what you might need. For example, sexual health actually could be a worse problem for many people practicing non-monogamy simply because if they were to admit that they need, say, to get STI tests or they have done this thing, what that's doing is it's not just that you're having trouble getting access to sexual health services. It might be that to get those services, you need to admit that you have lied or you have cheated, right? And so if you get rid of the cheating element, now how much of a barrier is there for you seeking something to improve your sexual health? I think the barrier is far less.
Yeah. And then a lot of providers and professionals aren't educated on consensual non
Yes.
monogamy. So if you go to a health clinic or even a doctor's office, they might look at you a little odd because they have no idea what you're doing. Yep.
So better education for everybody.
Now, at Sexual Health Alliance, we train a lot of people who work in sexual health spaces. So, what's the most important thing that you want to tell professionals about CNM?
One of the things that we've done is we've identified practices that people can engage in. But I actually think that what I've learned since we've done this is it's less useful to give advice about how people should do consensual non-monogamy as much as perhaps there are certain issues, there are certain challenges, certain topics that will show up again and again, problems that people will run into that maybe deserve focus during therapy, during counseling, a lot of consensual non-monogamy and making that work, especially for say a couple or people who are opening up, is not to say, well, do this, do this, do this, do this, and you're going to be fine, but rather maybe you need to think about disclosing attraction to a partner, or have you discussed how comfortable do you feel with your partner about communicating jealousy? What are some of the barriers there? And so it's not so much, hey, go communicate about jealousy and everything's going to be fine, because maybe if you talk about jealousy, things blow up. But it could be that you need to actually focus on, this is something you need to focus on, because maybe right now you're not communicating very well, or there's something getting in the way of you communicating very well. You don't give advice. What you do is you help someone kind of work through what they're going through, figuring out what's their personality, how's that working in, what's their home environment like, are their children involved, et cetera, all these variables. But then once you figure that out, then maybe focus on particular challenges that you will tend to encounter with people who are working through non-monogamy. So I think focusing on, for example, STI management, or focusing on how resources are distributed among partners, right? So maybe there's some amount of conflict happening because the way that people are sharing resources, spending time with one another, engaging in hobbies together, there's some kind of conflict that arises there because of the way that resources are shared. Or maybe compersion, right? You can't tell someone to just feel compersion, but is there something that you can do to foster this feeling of enjoyment that your partner is spending time with someone else?
That is great advice because not every person is the same. Not every relationship structure is the same. You have so many different personalities in there. You can't just come in and say, this is what you should do. This is what's
Yeah.
going to work. All right. Now, I want to talk to you about evolution and CNM. So,
Okay.
from an evolutionary perspective, what is most surprising to you about consensual non monogamy?
Yeah. So one of the things that we actually know pretty well is that humans are a pair bonding species. So regardless of whether you're monogamous or not, which is a different thing, that is, you're exclusive to one another. What humans tend to do is we pair bond. We find someone else, we get attracted to them, we have chemical cascades that contribute to you feeling close to someone else. And because we are a pair bonding species, we also tend to have certain reactions that help to keep that pair bond together. So for example, jealousy as an emotion is actually something that helps us to stay together, because if you detect that your partner is interacting with someone else and you fear that they might leave you for the other person, the jealousy will motivate you to go, if I feel like my relationship is a little more unstable or it might dissolve or something like that, then maybe what I should do is I should bring it up with my partner. I should express that jealousy to some degree to let them know, hey, I still care about you, right? This is important to me. We need to address this. And so given that we have this motivation to form pair bonds and to protect them, then the next step is, well, how do you actually incorporate a third, a fourth, or other people into that dynamic while still maintaining the pair bond? And so I think the tricky part, and the part that I've kind of run into again and again, is how do you find this middle ground between the evolved psychological machinery that has kept us pair bonded close together, which has facilitated childcare as well, because that's the purpose of a pair bond, is ultimately to provide support structure to potential offspring. How are people taking this system that is meant to kind of keep people in pair bonds and potentially keep away competitors, and now you are essentially inviting someone who could be a competitor? Not that they are, but maybe they are going to compete for time and resources, or how time is spent with children, etc. This is the puzzle that I'm working through.
How does an evolutionary framework help or sometimes complement our understanding of consensual non monogamy? Because, like you were saying, you would think that you would see somebody like this is a competitor. So, is
Mhm.
there like personality traits or a cultural aspect or other things that come into play here?
So the big advantage of using evolutionary theory for anything, for any scientific endeavor, what a theory is useful for is making predictions. Right. So we could make all kinds of explanations of why is this personality not getting along with this one, and all that would be very interesting. The advantage of using evolutionary theory here is, again, we're making predictions. And so one of the predictions that I made when I did my research using this perspective was, I think that there are certain problems that people are going to run into when they're trying to be non-monogamous. For example, there are recurrent issues like, let's say you're a man and then your female partner has sex with another man. What can happen is you can get pregnant, and then the original partner, the original man, can be cuckolded. And that would be a problem reproductively because it's not his genes getting passed on, it's someone else's. So I can predict, just based on the fact that we
Yeah.
tend to see competition across animal species. So it's not just humans. We see the same kinds of competition, especially among people of the same sex, but also competition between people of the opposite sex. We see that competition happening in other animals, so we can make the prediction that we are probably going to have many of the same problems. For most of the history of evolutionary psychology and those who study romantic relationships, that's precisely what they've been doing and then demonstrating. And so here, the idea is people who are trying to be consensually non-monogamous, they're still biological animals. They are going to run up against all the same problems as everyone else, people who are monogamous and people who have decided what I'm going to do is I'm just going to ignore other relationships and be monogamous, be exclusive, right? But instead, what they're doing is they're saying, well, we still want to pursue these other relationships. We want to foster connections. We want to at least be able to flirt. We want some of that freedom. So really what my prediction was, people have to figure out approaches, strategies, different practices for resolving some of those problems that we should predict, given that we are just also biological animals trying to survive, reproduce, compete, find good partners, keep those good partners, make sure that they help us raise children, et cetera, et cetera. It's all the same problems. It's just there might be a little bit extra. One of the things we do know is that there are certain people who tend to perceive the world in a more competitive way. The most common term for that is it's a zero-sum worldview. The idea that in any interaction with someone else, zero-sum means that if I win, you must lose. And if you win, I must lose. It's essentially that dog-eat-dog mentality that either I get in there first, I get what I want, or I'm going to lose, right?
Yeah.
They published a study actually looking at zero-sum beliefs, and they found that people who are in consensually non-monogamous relationships do tend to endorse fewer of these zero-sum beliefs, and they endorse more of what are called positive-sum beliefs. That is, by me interacting with you, we both benefit. We're both getting something out of this. And therefore, we're willing to do it. We've formed this relationship and we are putting on this episode, right? And so we see this as more of a positive sum interaction. With competitiveness, and especially monogamy, it's very easy to see other people as competitors. And that is something that we would, to some degree, predict from evolutionary theory.
Are you curious about sexology? Do you want to further integrate sexology into your work or your life? Well, friends, then we've got something just for you. It's called the Sexology Practice Guide, and it walks you through the ways this shows up in your work, in your life, and guides you through working within your scope, incorporating intimacy and sexual health into your work without starting over. Download this short, practical guide at sexologylab.com/guide. That's sexologylab.com/guide. And while you're here, make sure to subscribe and share. And now, back to the show. So, I want to talk about your CNM research. So, you're leading an international team of over 40 researchers studying relationship maintenance in CNM. So, what was the core question that launched this project?
The core question was, how do people do it? How do people make CNM work? One of my earlier papers was on what's called life history, and it kind of harkens to what I was describing before, as you have these different strategies of reproduction. You can kind of go fast and lots of children, or slow and invest in many of them. I collected that data. I actually looked at measurements of whether people tend to possess the characteristics of one strategy or another, because you tend to see certain personality characteristics go with one strategy versus another. And what we did find is that people in consensually non-monogamous relationships, compared to people in monogamous relationships, they tend to have more of the traits that you would expect of someone who's kind of a faster life history strategist, someone who is doing that quantity over quality game in terms of number of partners and number of offspring. What that really means is they were more willing to take certain types of risks, social risks. They're more willing to engage in risk-taking behavior. The other weird thing that you tend to see with fast life history strategists, specifically females of a species, because this is something you see regardless of humans, females within a species tend to go through a puberty earlier. And the idea is that if you start earlier, then you can have more children earlier and then kind of get that process out of the way. For a number of reasons, that's adaptive. So we saw some of these traits, but at the same time, people in consensually non-monogamous relationships are still satisfied. They're still forming these longer-term relationships that, the relationship satisfaction is very similar. So I kind of ran into this weird situation where individuals who are consensually non-monogamous, they might have a different profile of personality, maybe a profile personality that you would expect would create more conflict, right? Riskier behavior. And so if people are set up for this particular strategy, my guess was, well, maybe they're achieving the same level of satisfaction because they're doing something extra that kind of keeps those personality traits in check, right? So if you're someone who is a high risk taker, the solution is not to hector you until you're not a risk taker anymore. It's to do things to make sure that the risky behaviors you engage in are actually safer, right? So for example, if you're someone who is very interested in sex, you know you want to have sex with multiple partners, the solution may not be don't have sex with multiple partners. It might be take the precautions that you need to make sure that nothing bad happens by virtue of you doing that. And so that was really the inspiration. From there, we collected a bunch of data. We asked a bunch of people, what do you do to make a consensually non-monogamous relationship work? And so far, I would say that the data we've collected has supported that interpretation, that these are people who maybe are prone to doing things that can be risky within a relationship, but they're also doing things to reduce that risk.
Yeah. And I mean, really, it makes sense. People who aren't willing to take risks and aren't willing to be in risky social situations are not going to comfortably be able to thrive in a consensually non monogamous relationship.
That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Because you might have to expose yourself to some amount of risk, right? And then those people, I think, can benefit from the same things that the riskier people are doing, but the outcome is that they just kind of feel safer about it. There's one paper that a colleague and I just submitted using the data that we had where we were looking at something called regulatory focus. So when you're managing your emotions, when you're trying to regulate negative emotions, what is your goal ultimately? Is your goal to prevent bad things from happening, or is your goal to promote good things happening to you? And I think you can have either of those motivations, right? If maybe you're someone who's more motivated to have new experiences, find new partners, make new connections, what you're going to do is probably the things that help promote that. And so
Yeah.
some of these practices that we've identified, what we found are more helpful to people who are promotion focused because it helps them to achieve what they want to get from the relationship. But then there are other practices that help people who are prevention focused, who are more cautious. And they're saying, I would love to do this, but there are all these things in the way of me doing it. It's not that I have this great need to go out and have multiple partners. It's that I'm kind of interested, but I have more in the way than I have motivating me to kind of take that risk.
And like what you said, the first thing I thought was anxiety. Like if you're anxious, you're always trying to prevent problems from happening all the time.
Yep. That's what anxiety is. You're looking to the future and you have no idea what it looks like.
Right. All right. So tell me more about some of these relationship maintenance practices. What are some of the most consistent that you've seen so far?
So the most consistent, the ones that were strongest in our data set were actually that attraction disclosures, telling your partner that you are attracted to other people. And then the other one was how easily you communicate about jealousy. And I want to be clear, it's not whether you do communicate about jealousy, but whether you feel comfortable to communicate jealousy if you're feeling it. And the idea there is how competent are you at communicating this information, responding to it, having a discussion about it, what you should do in response to that jealousy. That's where I think the skill is. Communication about jealousy was very strongly related to a lot of our outcomes. So we measured 3 big categories. We measured overall satisfaction in the relationship. We measured the amount of conflict that they tend to experience. And then we also measured their health. So their physical health, their mental health, as well as their sexual health. And so what we found was that people who are communicating better about jealousy, there was a very strong relationship between that and better satisfaction. And I need to check because this is a newer manuscript, but I believe it was also associated with far less conflict. It was only slightly related to sexual health. There, I think jealousy will help with that, but there are other things that you can do for sexual health. That's the big one. Attraction disclosure was likewise. People who were disclosing their attraction, they tended to be happier, less conflictual, and I don't think that one was related to health. Willingness to care for children. That was kind of a big one that really, I think, applies specifically to parents who are poly. If you have a partner, one of the concerns you might have is if you bring someone else into either an existing situation or you're starting a new one, you might be concerned about how that partner is going to interact with your children. There are plenty of people who say, honestly, I just don't want you to have any interaction with my children, right? They want propriety over how those children are raised, what they're exposed to. Maybe they decide this person isn't someone I want around my children for whatever reason. But there are also people who say, well, yeah, I would love for you to be involved. In fact, that would be great. I want to raise my children in kind of a more community focused atmosphere. I want them to interact with multiple people, learn different personalities, right?
Yeah.
Through the home environment. Either of those can work. But I think underneath that is in either situation, you could communicate to your partner that if they wanted to, if it were relevant, you would be willing to help care. Maybe you don't provide very much care, but you'd be willing to do that because children take up a lot of time. There are a lot of resources. So if someone out there is willing to do something to be flexible with your children, that's going to help a lot, right? And that might actually be attractive too.
I'm thinking about children. Have you ever noticed that there's like different types of jealousy? Like maybe someone is not jealous of another partner, but they're jealous of someone else caring for their child.
That's actually one of the things we're going to be studying in our next project, which will be starting soon, is much more about childcare. There's a lot in our data set we don't know about children, but one of the differences we know about jealousy is that men tend to be more upset by sexual jealousy than what's called emotional infidelity. They experience sexual jealousy more easily than emotional jealousy. They kind of respond to and are distressed more by the thought of their partner having sex with someone else versus women, a stronger distress towards their partner falling in love with someone else. And so I wonder to what degree, if the other person is taking care of the children, what that's doing is it's showing your husband, hey, this woman's really good at taking care of children. Maybe he's going to fall in love with her for that. Maybe they're going to have their own children, and there's going to be that investment, the resource investment, the time investment, the emotional investment. Legitimately, that could be a reasonable anxiety or fear, right?
All right. Now, if you had to translate your findings into practical relationship advice, what would some of those tips be?
Looking at the 9 different practices that we identified in our study, it's not a matter of just do these things and everything will be better. It's rather talk about these subjects, talk about the disclosure of attraction, talk about compersion, talk about sexual health, talk about how resources are being distributed. And so I am hesitant to say that anyone should do any particular thing. For example, one of the items that I haven't talked about yet is hierarchy. A lot of people in C&M relationships, they'll practice hierarchy where one partner will be primary and maybe another one will be secondary. And often what's happening there is the primary partner might have preferential access to resources. You might live with a primary partner, but not live with the secondary. What's unclear is whether that's helpful or harmful, because I think it depends, right? If you're very hierarchical, that kind of hierarchy could protect a pair bond unit. Let's say you have children together, or you have shared property together, you're giving that partner the attention, the resources that they need for the relationship to really function at the level that has been expected, right? But at the same time, I think there's a lot of wisdom to people who argue for non-hierarchy, whereby often the secondary partner gets shortchanged. They get treated as a not full relationship. They're kind of kept on the sidelines a little bit, and they're told to wait a lot. So which one of those works? I'm not sure, because I think it's complicated. I think the hierarchy will work for some people in some situations, and non-hierarchy will be better for other people in other situations. So I would be hesitant to say, you should do this, you should be hierarchical, you should be non-hierarchical. But I do think that what advice I would give is you should have a conversation about how much hierarchy do you need to actually make this relationship satisfying, right? Because if you have children together, that's an obligation that you have. That's something that you did together, and that obligation's not going away. So you might have to legitimately give those children more time than you would give to another partner, or give more time to your primary partner with whom you've had children, just because that's a necessity. But maybe through that conversation, you realize, oh, I'm being possessive, or I'm demanding your time in a way that's actually genuinely unfair. And it's unfair to the second partner. So I think having the conversation will help to reveal, what do we need to preserve to make this relationship work? But also what might need to change so that we can actually make room for someone else. Again, don't do particular things, just have conversations
Yeah.
about particular topics.
I think that's great advice. All right. I want to talk briefly about safer sex practices. How do safer sex practices differ on average between CNM and monogamous populations?
So one of the manuscripts that we've recently submitted is we use data from my data set as well as data from a national Finnish data set. So we had a lot of people. We had like about 1,000 people in our sample, and then we had 11,000 people in the Finnish sample. And what we found is that overall, people who had multiple partners in either sample, they were no more likely to be safe about sex. They were no more likely to actually say, oh, I'm not putting myself in these situations because except for poly people, people who are polyamorous. This is all self-report. So it could be false. But the people who are polyamorous are saying, actually, we're getting tested for STIs very regularly. They scored much higher on these indices of doing things that are safe for having sex with multiple people. What I suspect might be happening here is if you compare polyamory to other types of consensual non-monogamy, polyamorous people, they find important connection and kind of emotional warmth, love, wanting to have that bond with someone else. And I think what that does is it might actually behave kind of protectively, where if you are bonded to someone, if you are warm to them, if you love them, you are invested in their well-being. You are invested in making sure that nothing bad happens to them. So there, people are probably being very responsible, very conscientious to protect the people that they care about. Versus someone, maybe if you're a swinger, if you're an open relationship, you're hooking up, you may not interact with these people again. And so the amount of caution you take where you're saying, well, how much do I really care about this person's well-being? It might legitimately be less than a partner who you are very connected to. And this is one of the things you see is some swinger populations, they do have higher rates of STIs. I wouldn't call that the most common pattern, but in certain situations, you're going to see that. So it really depends, I would say, from network to network. Some networks of partners are very responsible, and that does come across in some of the data. But then there are plenty of networks that are not responsible. So I would say the really good advice here in terms of sexual health is you have to take that responsibility into your own hands. In an ideal world, you'd be able to trust your network and that they would be 100% honest with you, but you might also have to take some of your own precautions. Take that personal responsibility yourself. And I think that if everyone took that personal responsibility more, you would de facto create these safer communities.
Before we go, I'd like to do a lightning round with you. So the first few things that come to mind. All right, the first one myth about CNM that you'd love to retire.
A lot of people see themselves, for example, as very jealous people. And because they are very jealous and they have this strong emotional reaction, they will not be fit to any kind of non-monogamy. They couldn't make it work. They're just not built for it, right? What we know, though, is that there are plenty of people who start out having very, very strong reactions, not because they are on some level biologically more predisposed to jealousy. They might be on some level. However, a lot of that intense jealousy could again come from not being prepared to deal with it, not being prepared to talk with a partner about it. And so if you are not prepared to talk about it, you're going to have a really strong reaction, because what else are you going to do to keep your partner around than kind of tell them, I'm really upset that you're thinking about having sex or falling in love with someone else, right?
Sometimes, like, someone might think that they would be super jealous. And then when they're actually in the situation, maybe like they actually feel a little differently.
Yep. Yeah, a lot of jealousy can come from just you're fabricating what will be, which may be very different from what actually is.
Right, right. All right, next question. What's one research finding that most surprised you?
People do define infidelity differently. What we found is that people who are in monogamous relationships tend to define infidelity based on specific acts. So that is, if you're having sex with someone else, if you're falling in love with them, that's infidelity. Compare that to people who are consensually non-monogamous. What they're doing is they are being very precise to say if it involves deception or it involves breaking an agreement. That is what infidelity is. One of the things I think a lot of people assume is everyone defines infidelity the same way. They do not. People define it differently, and you have to take that into account.
Yeah, that's so interesting. One research question you wish someone would fund tomorrow.
How people parent in consensually non-monogamous relationships. I think that that is something that we do not know. All the data that I gathered is about how people initiate these relationships and then maintain them just between, say, a pair bond or between multiple people. But I have no data about what happens when you kind of throw children in there and then how people navigate that. And I think that is an entirely different beast. And I will say this, I'm convinced that especially polyamorous families, are doing really well to raise their children. And I think that that is true. I believe that. However, as a scientist, I have to say, I don't think the data is all there yet. I don't think we have really good large-scale data about how people are managing childcare when they're being non-monogamous. And what we do have is usually non-monogamy looks like cheating, or it looks like something that happens outside the confines of monogamy. So if we could get funding for a study that is examining parenting specifically in these consensually non-monogamous relationships, I think that would reveal a lot of really interesting information.
Totally agree. All right. Now, if you could leave one message for the next generation, our Gen Zs, our Gen Alphas, what would that message be and why does it matter right now?
The most satisfying experiences I've ever had, whether emotional, sexual, or otherwise, has always been in a long-term, committed, not necessarily exclusive, committed, mutually supportive, loving, safe relationship. We maybe collectively are getting worse at figuring out how to maintain long-term relationships in a way that's really satisfying. So my advice would be learn how to build relationships that are durable, that are trusting, where you're able to communicate about difficult things that you really don't want to talk about, and don't avoid them. And be humble, because just because you think your partner's really bad at communicating, you probably are too. I'm going to leave it on that.
I love it. That's great advice. All right. Before we go, I want to ask you about your experience presenting with Sexual Health Alliance at our annual
Hmm.
sexological conference.
Yeah, I loved it. So I don't normally go to conferences with therapists or anything. I'm usually straight scientific. And I will tell you, it's a very humbling experience to get up in front of a group of people and say, this is the data I collected, and here's how I think you should apply it. And then they go, you don't know how to apply anything, do you? No, they didn't say that. But ultimately, it was like, oh, okay, well, how would you do this? What would you do this? How would you? So there was this translational process of kind of taking science and making it practical for people that I don't really think about very often. And that was great for me. But otherwise, the people are fantastic. I felt integrated. As conferences go and groups of people, it's a gem. It's a gem among a sea of conferences. This felt like people are here because they want to be there. They're learning with each other. They're helping each other. I thought it was a great experience.
I love hearing that so much.
Yeah.
We have such a passionate, engaged community. And that's one of the things I love about Sexual Health Alliance is every single person just loves this work in one capacity or another.
It's human work. It's humanitarian, right? Ultimately, sexual health, said this before, you solve some of the basic problems that people have when they're in relationships, that filters out into solving so many problems in life.
All right, Justin, thank you so much for being
Thanks,
with us
Michelle.
today.
Yeah, anytime.
All right, bye everyone. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen. Links are in the description below.